Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Paige and Henry, for putting together what I think is going to be a great program, and I'm glad to help us start off this morning. Before I get started, what I'd like to try to do first is just kind of set up where we are, okay? And so what is the challenge that we face when we think about the pharmaceutical industry? And it's that. That right there is the HIV/AIDS virus. Doesn't look so bad, or actually up there so big it kind of does, right? And essentially, HIV/AIDS emerged as a pathogen, as a retrovirus. It had been existent in humans since at least the 1960s, but it was only in the early 1980s that scientists began to notice this, that it began to turn into a pandemic, that infection rates were high, and people started to die in large numbers. And the rise of AIDS diagnoses and deaths during the 1980s not only killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, but also raised a wide variety of social, economic, and legal issues, whether or not you think about that from the cases that had to do with discrimination, to privacy, to employment law. And if you go back, and most of us here are old enough to remember that era, people said there would be no cure, that entire populations of Americans, particularly professional Americans, were in the arts community, so on and so forth, were just going to die. And that was going to be really too bad. And then between the late 1980s and early 1990s, a set of emerging techniques and approaches in biotechnology, some quite fundamental discoveries about the nature of the HIV virus, and of mechanisms for treating it, recognizing it and treating it, particularly through protease inhibitors, allowed effective AIDS management for those that could afford therapy. Indeed, these numbers up here are unbelievably staggering. So in 1993, 50,000 Americans died of AIDS, or an AIDS-related illness, and 80,000 were infected, had a new infection with this virus. Within a 3 or 4 year period, the number of deaths was more than halved. And while there was because of the nature of infection and also some public health strategies, there was also a dramatic decline in new incidents. Over time, as antiretroviral therapy has become more powerful, essentially we've gone from a world where AIDS is a death sentence to that Magic Johnson, still alive, right? I tell you, it's funny because the only time I think about HIV is when I have to take my medicine twice a day. He's had AIDS for almost 20 years, or HIV for almost 20 years. At the same time, even though that therapy is available, in principle, it's instead of inducing a worldwide reduction in deaths from AIDS-related illness, there was an increase over time concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. The primary reason why so many people have died in Africa is the inability of those economies and those countries to have a healthcare infrastructure and an ability to pay for that healthcare infrastructure and the medicines that would be required to deliver effective therapy. Only in the last few years, and you can sort of see it, right? Very significant expenditures on the part of mostly Western governments, charitable foundations, most notably the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have both provided AIDS therapies at dramatically reduced prices in the context of healthcare delivery strategies that are much more effective for the environments in which in which they live. Okay? So, I raised that kind of challenge up because in some sense, AIDS is one of the great success stories of modern medicine and of effective public-private collaboration between the government, universities, and the pharmaceutical industry, and even with insurers and the legal system, at least in the developed world. At the very same time, even though the innovation from pharmaceuticals became available, it was more than a decade and literally 20 million people later that we're starting to address and be able to deliver those same therapies in more challenging environments. Okay, so what are we going to do over the next few sessions? First, what I'm going to talk about, and we're going to probably do this, first what I'm going to talk about is what is distinctive about the pharmaceutical industry. I'm sure that some of you see a lot of this or are very, very interested in the particular topic, and some of you are coming at this from a more kind of raw perspective, and I'm going to try to kind of balance those audiences, and that's going to be, we might go a tiny bit over, if it's okay, on this first session relative to the time of the break, because I just want to make sure we get through that in a careful way, and then we'll kind of tee up, and I promise you we're not going to go over time in general, and we're going to have more than enough time for break. Okay. So first we're going to ask what's so distinctive about the pharmaceutical industry. And we're going to think a little bit about the history, and we're going to think a little bit about the economics. Then we're going to turn to really where does pharmaceutical innovation come from? And I'm going to try to make a case that there's something that really changed about what we do in this country and around the world over the past 20 or 30 years. It's closely linked with the biotechnology industry, but it's more accurately characterized as an entire life sciences innovation system. And then we're going to think about what many of you probably have heard about, you see, and some of the legal issues that arise is why don't we, is innovation in the pharmaceutical industry slowing down? Is there a productivity crisis? Is there a new treatments crisis? I'm going to try to frame that around that innovation system. And then finally, in our last session, we'll really think about the strategic choices and the development of the value chain, something we'll kind of build in a number of ways, how particularly products, new and emerging products from biotechnology are getting into the marketplace. So, let's get started. So, I guess I have one more thing before we really get started, okay, is where are we going? So I want you to have the conclusions from the next few hours already in hand so we can sort of pick them up as we go along. The first argument I want to make, and it will be a theme throughout this, is that the promise of the life sciences and biopharmaceutical innovation offer the promise, though it's not guaranteed, of dramatic opportunities for improvement in our treatment of disease and essentially human welfare. Essentially, when you talk to the scientists, they tell a story that's about we are entering the life sciences century. And that leads to the second theme, which is that it turns out that our ability to realize those benefits as a society is not simply a matter of having some guys and people, men and women in labs working hard, but actually it is equally or even more dependent upon effective institutions and an effective legal framework for developing, commercializing, diffusing, paying for, reimbursing, and administering pharmaceuticals. Okay? Institutions and law shape both the incentives to innovate and the ability to maximize the social value that arrive from scientific discovery and technological innovation. And then my last theme, and I think it's something that you'll see in several of the panel sessions that will follow, is that the difficulty is that law moves slow. Science, and particularly this science, is moving forward at an incredibly rapid rate. Okay? In fact, so rapidly that it's outstripping the capacity of our legal framework and our institutions and our public policy institutions, both at the state level and the federal level, to effectively address how we bring on this innovation into the system in a way that really delivers the kind of benefits that we hope it would. Okay, now, on to some history. So, where'd pharmaceuticals come from? So, the first point to take away is that all things new are really old, and pharmaceutical and medical preparation appears really, it's one of these areas that appears across a wide range of ancient civilization. In particular, the Divine Farmer's Herb Root Classic, written in China and kind of collected as a kind of series of kind of pieces of folk wisdom, became the source of Chinese herbal medication and was really the first pharmaceutical preparation dictionary and encyclopedia in the world, or the one that was most complete in the world. From a European perspective, and on the institutions that we're eventually going to adopt in the United States, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was thinking of something to do in Sicily after he had conquered it, I guess. And one thing he did was he clarified the role of what a pharmacist was. And in particular, he separated the role of the pharmacist from that of the doctor. Second, he said, we want you to be organized more like a guild, so you're going to be a profession. And thirdly, that part of being part of that guild and part of getting presumably some of the exclusivity and monopoly power and market power that comes from being a medieval guild was a legal and professional duty for careful preparations and careful mixtures. Now let's be clear, essentially what you had was most of your apothecaries or pharmacists or whatever you want to call them were essentially kind of sitting in their backyard and kind of trying to figure out something that would make the townsfolk happy and earn them a little bit of money. That was their basic plan, and some of them were very good and some not so good. Okay? But the key point was that really the institutions of pharmacy and the notion of the idea that there's pharmaceutical preparation separate from a physician goes back to essentially a pre-capitalist era. So if you go back to Shakespeare, here we are at the end of Romeo and Juliet, and O true apothecary, thy drugs are quick, thus with a kiss I die, and then Juliet unfortunately kills herself, not of course realizing that the apothecary had also given Romeo something to make him, I guess sleep or whatever it might be. So I guess he had killed himself. There you go. I'm forgetting Romeo and Juliet on the fly here. Okay, so Romeo, so when you think about it, the notion of what an apothecary was and what a pharmacist was very well established by the 16th century. Okay. On the other hand, the idea of a pharmaceutical company and the idea of doing innovation that would then be delivered to patients through the doctor-patient relationship and then have prescriptions filled by a pharmacy really is a much more recent phenomenon. So the history of the modern pharma industry reaches back really to the early 19th century, closely linked with the very important emergence of the chemical industry over the course of the 19th century. Most important, the discovery of aniline dyes in England in the late 1850s, and then that transferred over to Germany, really kind of grew the entire chemical industry, and with it, the pharmaceutical industry. The most important development in the development of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of creating it as an economic industry, believe it or not, development of the periodic table. It's going to be really hard to get patent protection on drugs if you don't know what they are. And by being able to create composition of matter patents, that was an incredible institutional shift that I'll talk about in a second. The firms, and even firms that you've heard about today, they're old. When we talk about traditional pharma firms, these firms have cultures that literally date back centuries. So Merck Schaap and Dahm was literally founded in 1668. Okay? Frederick Merck purchased a pharmacy. By 1827, he was essentially, his great-great-grandson at that point, had developed and marketed large-scale productions of pure alkaloids. What are alkaloids? Like quinine. So that's quinine up there. In 1891, apparently a not particularly favored son of the grandson now, gets shipped over to New York to start an American office in New York. He moves some of the operation down to New Jersey relatively quickly. And then during World War I, all German assets, so there were a bunch of pharma companies, German and Swiss pharma companies that had assets in the US, most notably Bayer and Merck. Their assets are confiscated and reestablished as American companies. So, what we see by the end of the 19th century is essentially the underlying value chain around pharmaceuticals that we live with today. There were a diverse array of companies led by the German and Swiss, but there were also others, that were involved in the development, the testing, the production, and the marketing of pharmaceuticals, and were at that point removed from the relationship between physician and patient. Okay? Importantly, each part of that structure of R&D, testing, production, marketing, and sales is essentially going to evolve over time and respond to the underlying legal and institutional environment. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days. Okay, so just to give you one set of that, I've already hinted at this piece, is let's just look at how did the establishment of, what influenced the R&D piece. So there had always been some patents on pharmaceuticals back to the 1700s. And you know how you got a patent in the 1700s? If you were really good friends with the king or the duke, then you would get a royal patent, and that was really good because it really was a very strong monopoly, and it was essentially lasted, I think, for many instances as long as the king wanted it to, and you were in pretty good shape. Okay? By the 1840s, particularly in the United States, there's the huge rise of what are called patent medicines. Patent medicines were, in fact, essentially, people would invent any concoction that they wanted. They would sort of send it into the patent office, which at that point was mostly a certification service. Okay, it didn't have the kind of careful examination function that we have today. That only appeared towards the end of the 1840s. And essentially, they get this patent, and they say, this is patented, approved by the US government. And then they kind of go around the villages, and they would sell their patent medication, and before people realized they got sick, they'd be out of town with the cash. Okay? On the other hand, by the 1860s, the development of the periodic table offered the new paradigm for structuring property rights for clinical structures. In particular, there were really key lawsuits that, if you read them, are essentially the same lawsuits we have today about things like patentability. Okay? For example, there was a quite contentious lawsuit over aspirin. Was aspirin really a novel compound? And was it a novel combination? So just to give you some, this is from a recent study that actually shows this impact of the periodic table on really shaping and changing the nature of innovation in the chemical and pharmaceuticals industry. So essentially what you see is the periodic table essentially gets established and everyone sort of agrees basically what it is by 1869. There's essentially, this is from a study of inventions from World's Fairs, from various World's Fairs, and essentially some of the inventions of the World Fairs are patented and some are not. And what you see over time is there's a very dramatic increase in the share of the chemical innovations, and that includes a high share of pharmaceuticals, though not on the graph that the author Petra Moser happened to show, essentially end up being these patented innovations. Second, we end up at the same time in that 19th century starting to build the regulatory framework that we live with today. Okay? In particular, there was, essentially everyone agreed aspirin was pretty good, but everything else looked a little dicey. Okay? So essentially by the 1850s, the American Pharmaceutical Association had established itself and adopted, code of ethics and all that good stuff. During the Lincoln administration, Lincoln appoints the first head of the Bureau of Chemistry, which after a few switches essentially becomes the Food and Drug Administration. And most importantly, in 1906, Congress passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, which essentially established the basic rules that you had to accurately disclose what was in your product and that you couldn't adulterate it. Okay? Moreover, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act also was part of a movement in which you saw Congress and states start regulating in a number of ways the essentially controlled substances. So this is the time in which cocaine goes from being essentially as legal as you want it to being an illegal substance by the federal government. Okay. And you go back and remember, this is not, we tend to think of this as a long time ago, but it's not that long, right? So this is from, believe it or not, the early 20th century, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but on the bottom there we have Pratt's healing ointment for man and beast. We both use it. Cures harness and saddle galls. Get it here today. And there was this kind of notion that these pill peddlers were sort of going around, and that's what people and commerce and most newspapers and regulators thought of the pharma industry, that it was a sort of a scam. And you know why they believed that? Because in 1910, it really was. Okay? And so what you ended up with is an increase. There was a sort of separation between a small group of emerging medicinal chemists and chemical synthesists who essentially were trying to make fundamental scientific progress, and they had an industry that a few firms were being helpful, and particularly they were in Europe, but particularly the American firms, many of them, most of them now lost to history, were essentially these kind of showmen, kind of artists. So what you end up with is, for example, it is only from laboratories free of any relations with manufacturers that real advances can be expected. So there was this notion that what you needed to do was publicly fund or fund in a university the materials to do basic research. Just to give you kind of one sense of this, in Arrowsmith, the famous book by Sinclair Lewis, right? The key character, which is Arrowsmith's mentor, he says, how could old Max have gone over to the damn pill peddler? Of all the people in the world, Max was his mentor in the medical school, and now he's gone to sort of be essentially a pharma research guy and salesman. Of all the people in the world, I wouldn't have believed it, Max Gottlieb falling for those crooks. Interestingly, a lot of what we're going to hear about over the next 2 days is, should a university professor working with a pharmaceutical company have to disclose that relationship and under what conditions? And I think an interesting point that I think comes out in the legal context is that even if the doctors say, even if the medical researcher is sort of doing the right thing and the firm has set it up pretty appropriately, I think that this quote, though I don't think we're quite in the days of Sinclair Lewis, I think reflects some public beliefs about the relationships between medicine and industry. And I think it's important to incorporate into our thinking as we think about where some of this evolution's come from, where some of the law is going to come from. Actually, let me see if we can find some water. Excuse me. So then, In particular, the most important change that then happens is in the late 1930s. And in the late 1930s, there's one of these kind of flim-flam artist firms essentially puts a product on the market that's essentially antifreeze, or solvent is essentially antifreeze, and they kill 100 children. Not surprisingly, Congress thinks that's bad, right? And so in response, and this is going to be a very common theme, and I think is important to think about as you think about where law and institutions come from in this environment. Every single time there's a tremendous public health failure or a safety and efficacy failure, what you see is a huge number of politicians basically getting on the bandwagon to rewrite some laws. And that's fine. So what do? They write, in fact, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which essentially replaces the 1906 law. And the most important thing is it says, hey, guess what? You're going to have to show safety, for sure, and that's going to involve clinical trials. Okay? Moreover, your labeling has to describe the ways that your drug can be used safely, and it gave the FTC the explicit right to manage the piece of advertising over essentially regulating, essentially direct-to-consumer or direct-to-physician advertising in the pharmaceutical industry. And then what you get is essentially that law didn't do so badly for the Mercks of the world or the Pfizers, who were sort of at that point really trying to emerge as pharmaceutical firms, but it put all the quack artists out of business. And there's a real shift. And so then what you have is by essentially right after World War II, you really can, see the modern pharmaceutical industry, or the modern traditional pharmaceutical industry, or old pharma, or big pharma. And each of those circles is essentially basically the employment of different labs, okay? And what you can see is that the place that looks like New Jersey has a lot more circles and a lot bigger circles than the rest of the country. And the New Jersey corridor, just outside of Philadelphia, basically moving up to New York, turns out to be the kind of key home for pharmaceutical R&D and pharmaceutical, essentially the kind of management of pharmaceutical enterprises in the United States. Of course, there are others. Eli Lilly in Indianapolis, Abbott just to our north. Okay, and what you get is a real change in this relationship between medicine research, medical research, and industry. So, for example, Selman Waksman, who essentially, Selman Waksman, who invented a whole range of antibiotics, including streptomycin. He said, without the help of the industrial organization, and that industrial organization was Merck, that took over a major part of the pharmacological evaluation and large-scale production, our contribution would have never obtained its goal. In other words, he was working at a university, and he sort of now what you saw much more was chemists who had discovered things in laboratories sort of seeking out pharmaceutical laboratories to take advantage, to commercialize their innovations. And what you get is the era of miracle cures. And it really should, I think it's important to recognize how important this era was. So in 1921, some researchers at the University of Toronto figure out that diabetes, type 1 diabetes, is caused by a lack of insulin. And by 1922, they've worked with Eli Lilly, and they've started giving it to patients. They win the Nobel Prize in 1923, and Eli Lilly becomes the dominant player in the insulin market for the next 75 years. When you think about, for those of you who have ever owned Lilly stock or whatever it might be, Eli Lilly essentially was, that and essentially some things essentially around antidepressants were the major sources of their business for essentially 75 years. Okay. And that's when what we see, and then, however, that era of miracle cures, whether or not it was the penicillins, whether or not it was, what else did we have there? the beginning of antidepressants, so on and so forth. Then what happens is all of a sudden things are kind of moving along, and then you get the thalidomide scandal. And most of you know that. This is a terrible, terrible disease, terrible genetic disorder. And essentially, the story here, though, is quite interesting if you haven't sort of recollected it in a while, okay? There was two issues there. So thalidomide was being commercialized. It was being hailed as a drug that would do a variety of things to basically make pregnancy easier. And essentially what happens, is that it gets commercialized in a bunch of other countries around the world, and there's an officer at the FDA who refuses to approve the drug. And so then, however, the thalidomide gets distributed in unregulated clinical trials. So at clinical trials at that time, there was essentially no oversight of them. Essentially minimal federal oversight, minimal state oversight, essentially zero. And so what you end up with is that the incidence of genetic disorders arising from thalidomide use in the US is a very, very tiny number relative to Europe, relative to other places throughout the world. And the interesting part is that Kefauver then takes away from that in some sense that we shouldn't have waited for the one, we can't always rely on one obstinate FDA officer who was essentially exceeding her statutory authority. And so we end up with the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments, which essentially ushered in what looks like like the clinical trial process and pre-marketing and post-marketing approval process that we see today. Most important, you now have to not only show safety, but efficacy. You have to monitor and then report any adverse events. That requirement is, of course, at the heart of many of the liability claims that litter our courts. Many of you have had to deal with, I'm sure. And then finally, there was going to be essentially a really serious amount of federal oversight of the clinical trials themselves in the form of essentially an interaction between the pharmaceutical company and the FDA in terms of describing in terms of making an approval decision. Okay, so essentially this went from essentially what was effectively a rubber stamp in the 40s and 50s to a fairly onerous regulatory framework, and that degree of complexity of the regulatory system only increased over time. Okay, and that essentially has left us with what is by now an extremely costly drug development and approval process. There are two things to know, or I guess three things to know about the drug approval process. The first is it takes a long time, on the order of more than 10 years from discovery to marketing on average for those that are successful. The second is that a given pharmaceutical firm might screen literally 10,000 or more compounds, and now actually many more than that, to commercialize any one drug. And even once they kind of pick the small number that they're going to really put into, do some serious investigative work on, essentially the hit rate is about 2%. So in other words, even among those projects that someone gave manager said, listen, green light, let's take this out, let's, for example, start working with humans on it, essentially what you're going to be talking about is essentially a 2 to 4% hit rate, depending on where you define the beginning of the process. Okay. And let me just make one last comment. So it's long, it's complicated, and it's expensive, right? So we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go, but our most recent estimates of the average cost burden of bringing a single drug to market is about $1.2 billion. Now, that's not for that one particular drug. That's also including in expected value all of the failures involved in the process, okay, and as well the cost of capital. Okay. Alongside that, and let me make my last point on this, sorry about that. The last part is a lot of policy analysts, a lot of legal scholars, a lot of economists looked at the beginning of this process towards the late 1960s and the early 1970s, and they said, uh-oh, we've gone from underprotecting, resulting in a thalidomide problem, to over-regulating the ability to bring drugs to market. That we're going to have a dramatic reduction or dramatic fall off in our ability to deliver these miracle drugs. Then what happens? The next moment is something that was really independent of the pharmaceutical industry. The white knight of the pharmaceutical industry came from the very group that the pharmaceutical industry had been very careful to avoid talking to for 100 years, and that was biologists. Okay? So what happens is that beginning in the early 19th, well, let me go back. Beginning in the late 1930s, but then certainly in 1953, with the characterization of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick, that once you figure out the structure of DNA, a tremendous number of the smartest scientists in the world basically gravitate towards one area in biology, which is essentially kind of broadly microbiology or biochemistry or genetics. Because all of a sudden the power of understanding genetics and understanding biochemistry, essentially exactly what makes cells work and how particular disease, for example, when you get sick, what's really going on at a cellular level or even at an intracellular level, how that's really characterizing that becomes the dominant scientific question. By the 1970s, and we're going to kind of come back to this, that emerging body of really kind of very basic upstream research, where the best thing you could ever hope for was winning yourself a Nobel Prize, but really very far removed from any therapy, from any particular human benefit, leads to, however, an area called biotechnology. And biotechnology was driven by three key forces. The first of those was that we just started spending a lot of money. It was stimulus, right, for what we're doing, right? Essentially, there were two different sources. One was public funding. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, essentially the war on cancer. The second was the emergence of the venture capital industry, which started allocating capital to very long-term projects in biotech that were emerging from America's universities. The second part was there was a reason we were spending money, was that there was a cluster of related scientific breakthroughs. The most noted one, the full list would go on for pages, but the two ones that are really important was essentially the work by Cohen and Boyer, in which they figured out how to essentially do to genes what you do with your word processor, cut and paste. Okay, so it was the ability to essentially cut genes out of cut genetic material and snip genetic material out of a strand of DNA, and then paste that back in and insert it back in and essentially get that to be expressed, in particular, essentially to grow and to have the function of the genetics be expressed in other environments. This was also an era where we saw a shifting institutional environment that supported this kind of basic research being somehow transferred very quickly to industry despite potentially any risks. There are three important things there. One was the Bayh-Dole Act, which essentially was the act that allowed that was explicit in saying that if a Northwestern researcher receives federal money and discovers something, that the intellectual property is owned by some combination of the researcher and Northwestern, depending on whatever agreement they've come up with, and the federal government is essentially going to stay out of the process. Moreover, that they can get a patent and that they are explicitly encouraged as a requirement of receiving federal money to attempt to commercialize or to see if that can be commercialized in some way. So there was really a kind of there was this belief that there was a lot of work going on at great universities that was essentially sitting on people's shelves because there was no way to turn the kind of basic science into the technological innovation. Okay? The second, and once again, I think that there was a whole legal and institutional movement that kind of supported all these rules, so many people worked on all these three things at the same time. The second was the case called Diamond versus Chakrabarty, which was a Supreme Court case that essentially said you could have intellectual property rights on living organisms as long as they did not appear naturally in nature. Okay? So a big difference for those of you, essentially, if you think back to the good old days of Spider-Man, if you might remember, the old one, he had radiation, and then he got his spidey sense. That's unpatented. In the new Spider-Man movies, Spider-Man gets bitten by a genetically engineered spider and gets his spidey sense. He should form a biotech company because that is a patentable invention. Okay? So the third thing was that the Supreme Court, I guess it was the district court, that clarified, and there were some institutions that clarified the prudent man rule, that essentially said it was okay for big institutional investors to go and, for example, state pension funds or university endowments to invest in risky ventures as long as their portfolio was diversified in a way that those risks were balanced. That worked for 38 years. Okay, right? Okay, and so what do you see? So it might be a little bit hard to see, but that structure up there on the right is the insulin gene. Kind of looks pretty cool. And essentially, as soon as Cohen and Boyer figured out that they could extract DNA and insert it back in, for example, they could take a human gene and insert it into bacteria, and the bacteria would produce whatever the human gene was programmed to produce. As soon as they did that, it became immediately clear to everyone that there was one very valuable product that could be developed with these new tools, and that was insulin. So between 1921 and 1974, diabetics were treated by extracting cow and pig insulin, basically from slaughterhouses, and essentially refining them so that they were okay for humans, and then you kind of hoped for the best. Some people died because they had allergic reaction or they didn't treat well with that. And more generally, it was a generally miserable experience to have your cow and your pork insulin when really what you wanted was good old human insulin. Okay? So what they do? So what you see is the emergence of a very different type of research and a different type of interaction in the context of synthetic insulin. Essentially, what you see are little teams, not big pharma companies, little teams of maybe 10 to 15 people using these new tools and competing with each other in a priority race to get a contract with the big pharma firm. So there were 3 teams in this particular race. 2 of them were located in San Francisco. One was actually at UCSF. The other was, in fact, founded by Herb Boyer and was called a company called Genentech. Okay, this was their first product. The third team was located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was kind of out of Harvard University, and was run by Wally Gilbert, a Nobel Prize winner himself. Okay? They essentially pursued the extraction and expression of human DNA. And what was interesting, okay, was that, and this was a kind of big lesson that everyone started to learn about how these teams were going to be organized, was that the teams that were in universities, even though they talked a lot, if you go back and look at their notes, they talked a ton and they were very open, that they were hoping to discover something and then make a lot of money, but they also wanted to get tenure and get publications and maintain the good reputation with their academic colleagues. So they chose a way of producing insulin using these techniques that was itself scientifically kind of interesting. Essentially, they were really going to show that you could take insulin from a kind of extract insulin from a kind of human source and transfer it to a bacteria. Unfortunately for the people who were doing that, that was highly regulated at the time. There was a belief that we didn't know if we should actually manage using human DNA. The city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, actually had a ban on all genetic engineering. The mayor had seen the Andromeda strain on television the night before a key council meeting and came kind of saying, no more of that. I don't want that movie in my town. He was also not very friendly with Harvard, and he thought that was a way to kind of stick him in the eye. Where Genentech took a very different approach. They went to a chemical supply shop. They bought some A, C, T, and G, the 4 things that make up genes, and they just built that gene from scratch. No one had thought that that was interesting to do scientifically, so it was completely unregulated. So they actually were, as opposed to the other teams that had to work out of essentially biowarfare facilities at the time, they worked just in a warehouse that was by San Francisco Airport. And if you go to that very warehouse today, there's a huge complex called Genentech. Not one of the lessons people learned from that case, the industry has started to learn, the venture capitalists started to learn, university administrators started to learn, people thinking about policy, is that universities, even though a lot of the work that was being done in this industry happens in university and is fundamentally scientifically interesting, a theme we're going to return back to, universities are bad firms. They're just not good at this stuff. And so that you had to create a space for little entrepreneurial firms to form at the kind of boundaries of the university and let them exist. And a whole legal and institutional environment was set up to reinforce that idea. Humulin, the product that came out of Genentech's effort, was commercialized through a license with Eli Lilly. Remember Eli Lilly, the dominant firm in the insulin market before that. While Biogen, the firm that was started by Wally Gilbert to commercialize his innovation, ultimately partners a sort of a slightly different version a few years later with the Danish company Novo Nordisk. So, just kind of, let me just do a little bit of understanding of time, okay? So let's just kind of think of where we are, right? We're going to come back to these themes in our second session. The development of insulin was simultaneously a fundamental scientific discovery. So a lot of the work that was done, if you go back and read the articles, both it turned out the ones done at Genentech, as well as the ones done at Harvard, as well as the one done at UCSF, they turn out each of them to be some of the most highly cited and most impactful articles in all of science in the 1970s. The second part, relative to that map I showed you before, where there were a bunch of pharmaceutical companies employing thousands of researchers in isolated laboratories in the New Jersey countryside, this commercialization or the work arose in close geographic proximity to the science due to the location of both key scientists and a pool of life science researchers, all the postdocs and other resources. While the innovation was close to the science, the production and the distribution were not, right? So commercialization occurred by and large through partnerships with more established pharmaceutical firms and in locations very distant from the underlying science. So you needed a whole welter of laws and institutions to figure out, for example, how you were going to manage these contracts and what, for example, how to think about the different statuses of the firms. For example, in the insulin case, Eli Lilly and Genentech ultimately got in a huge battle over the royalties from the quite successful Humulin products. At which point they immediately did what? Went to court. But before they could go to court for a very long time, they first had to decide which court to go to. And Eli Lilly had a very, very careful documentation of why, when you really thought about it, despite the fact that all the work was done in California, surely the relevant commercialization activities had occurred in Indianapolis. So the case should be tried in Indianapolis. And of course, Genentech's lawyers argued exactly the opposite and argued for the court being, jurisdiction being in California. Okay? More generally, both the timing and the pattern of innovation for insulin was shaped by the interplay between scientific norms and commercial motives and differences in the regulation of biotechnology research in different locations. Okay? And then over time, this biotechnology industry has sort of evolved. And that evolution has been uneven and complex. So if anyone tells you that this is what a biotech company does, that may be what some biotech companies do. So over time, what you see is the companies started out with these kind of entrepreneurial idea that they were going to produce products. They were going to produce new drugs, and those new drugs were going to be first licensed out maybe to the big pharma firms and commercialized through that, but then they were going to go themselves become big pharma companies. By and large, that vision essentially failed. There were a few big successes like insulin, a few like monoclonal antibodies, and a few other things, but that basic vision failed. Then they decided, you know what we'll do? We'll develop tools for the pharmaceutical industry. And so you see companies such as Incyte and Affymetrix and Celera grow up. And those were essentially companies that were essentially synthesizing genes, developing genomic databases, and creating tools to do pharmaceutical research itself. And then finally, in the kind of last 10 years, what you see is a wide variety of hybrid organizations and different people still trying to figure out what the heck is a biotech company? How, essentially, what is its relationship? How important is the research relative to the commercialization activities? And what is its relationship with the established firms in the industry, with academic medical centers, and with doctors and patients? So, okay. Ultimately, over the past 15 years, I'd say even the last 20 years, what we've seen is then a continued evolution of the institutional framework that has allowed for essentially two big things. The first is in 1984, the Hatch-Waxman Act was passed, which essentially dramatically lowered the barriers to entry for generic drugs. So prior to that time, even after the patent had expired and FDA exclusivity had passed, a generic manufacturer would essentially have to do the same battery of clinical trials that the original manufacturer had done. After the Hatch-Waxman Act, all you really had to do was show, I mean, it was not completely inexpensive, but it was essentially show bioequivalence. Okay? To show bioequivalence. In addition, okay, and for that, the established pharma industry got essentially an increase guaranteed of the number of years until they faced any generic competition. Okay. Then, over the 90s, the regulatory environment was changed mostly in one direction, and mostly in a fairly bipartisan manner, and that's continued over the last decade, to essentially focus on one thing and one thing only, on somehow making the FDA more responsive. Okay? So the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA, which I believe is going to be discussed later in the sessions, essentially was the idea that if the pharmaceutical companies were willing to pony up some funds to actually get the clinical trial process on the government side through, that was going to accelerate the review process, accelerate the prioritization. The Food and Drug Modernization Act of 1997 also created a fast track for particular new types of drugs, so on and so forth. Okay? What are the consequences of that shift in the institutional environment on the structure and evolution of the industry? Essentially, over time, the Hatch-Waxman Act is one of the most decisive pieces of healthcare legislation in terms of a market competition aspect, in terms of reducing costs, that we've ever seen. Essentially, more than 57% of prescriptions are filled by generic. However, it's less than 10% of revenues. Right? Because the generic prices are so much lower than the prices for the products that are still on patent, the vast majority of revenue accrues to the pharma and biotech firms, while the majority, and a fairly significant majority, of prescriptions is being filled by the generics. PDUFA is well known to have been a law that seemed to have one of the best effects of laws of all time, which it was passed in 1992. It took effect in 1995, and in a one-year period, the number of drugs approved by the FDA more than doubled. And in the Clinton White House, there was a lot of hoo-hoo. And then what happened over time, as more regulations got put in and the clinical trial became ever more onerous and complicated, which is what has happened, essentially what we've ended up with over time is a return back to the 10 to 20, maybe 25 drug approvals per year rather than the more than 50 that we were able to achieve for a single year in the first year of the PDUFA legislation. Okay. With that said, right, I don't want to be sort of too depressing about this. One of the things that's useful to think about when thinking about this industry is that there really has been a sea change in how human beings live because of innovation in this industry. Whether or not it's due to insulin and penicillin in the first half of the century, birth control, it's very routine that if you ask people the most important innovation in their lives, it will turn out that a very high number of people will claim the birth control pill as being just the most fundamental innovation that they couldn't live without or that's been most important to them. The development of minor tranquilizers like Valium. During the 1970s, you really see the rise of somewhat effective chemotherapy, particularly combination chemotherapy. In 1980s, you end up much more moving to science-based drugs, drugs that really are building on this biochemistry revolution, such as the anti-cholesterol drugs, Prozac, AZT. And then in the 1990s, what we see are AIDS combination therapies, probably the most decisive clinical advance of the 1990s. And then you start seeing the pharmaceutical industry sort of getting into some new businesses that may be less, that are, right? So we have Viagra and we have Rogaine as being the dominant products for leading pharmaceutical firms, right? So what do we take away from all this? Is that over time, there has been a coevolution between this kind of emerging first chemical and then biological knowledge base, spelled incorrectly, the legal institutional framework, as well as industry structure. Many of the hot button issues that we face today, from patent validity for incremental innovations, duties for pharmaceutical firms to disclose adverse reactions or new scientific findings, think Merck and Vioxx, recall earlier debates, controversies, and policy shifts. In some sense, there's a lot we can learn and a lot we can look back in the case law, the institutional law, and the institutional history to actually draw lessons in our reasoning. Over time, there has been an inexorable, if sometimes uneven, way that I'll emphasize a little bit more later, shift towards a scientific basis for drug discovery and development. Essentially, this is the ultimate science-based business now. Essentially, we're essentially running an experiment that is much more expensive and much more broad than the effort we made to put man on the moon. Essentially, we spend a huge amount of, as we'll talk about in the second session, we spend a huge amount of money, both in the public and the private sector, on delivering this healthcare and life sciences innovation infrastructure, and essentially that has been the dominant way that we've shifted towards a basis of innovation in the industry. And despite that promise, there are persistent concerns that I'll return to over R&D productivity for the industry and the ability to translate this kind of potential that when you talk to the scientists, you feel like everyone's going to get better tomorrow, to meaningful clinical outcomes that actually work for patients and society. Okay, so let me just make sure I understand. Oh, right on time, look at that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm now going to shift and give just a little bit more of a, so we're now kind of up to the modern time. I'm just going to give a little bit more of a contemporary overview of the underlying basic economics of the industry, okay? And essentially what we know about that today and a little bit moving forward, and then we'll break. So, I'm an economist, so when I'm a very simple thinker as well, so I try to think about costs and I try to think about benefits, and then there you go. So, what are the key economic drivers of biopharma? Essentially, one point we've already talked about is that there are extremely high sunk costs of innovation. Right? that on the one hand, that sunk costs are grounded in funding science and clinical trials and things that are fairly analytical, but they're capital expenditures nonetheless, and the expenditures take place over time with multiple milestones. So as opposed to a decision to build an apartment building, where once you pour the concrete, you're probably either going to build the building or not, pharmaceutical firms and biotech firms essentially face many, many milestones along the way before they produce a drug, and for the paid market. A key consequence of that is that a pharmaceutical R&D project is essentially what we call a real option. Essentially, it means that over time we gather information, and as we gather information, we can decide, should we undertake more of this very costly expenditure to go one step further, or should we drop the project overall? Second, while there's extremely high sunk costs, there's extremely low marginal cost. For small molecules, essentially the kind of little tablets, for small tablets, traditional pharma type tablets, really the main cost is distribution, and if there's any non-fixed cost to their marketing expenditures, which could occur, for example, if they're putting promotions with pharmacists to promote their particular brand, or if they're kind of pushing pharmacists or healthcare organizations to push their particular drug. Okay? Biologics, the outputs of the biotechnology industry, tend to be associated with higher relative costs. It turns out that the bacteria will grow all the stuff that you want, but it does it slowly and more costly than we had hoped. Okay? Thirdly, so you have extremely high sunk costs and low marginal costs of production. So far, this looks like something like the software industry, where we worry about that, and then the problem is that no one can ever make money on it because people then just steal the software once you put it on the internet. But the nice thing about pharma, and the thing that really creates, I think, an important piece there, is that there's a very strong but time-limited product monopoly for a given drug. Outside of all areas of patentability, composition of matter patents are essentially considered by practitioners, I think both lawyers as well as, and most notably by managers and sort of senior executives, the strongest type of intellectual property. They feel like that's the most robust property right they can get. And FDA exclusivity, the rules of the FDA explicitly allow you to have the product market for a given length of time. There's a recent spate of cases that are actually challenging that doctrine as we speak. And I think that are challenging it as we speak. I'll come back to that later. And then finally, though, that doesn't mean there's no competition in pharmaceutical markets. In fact, there's lots of competition. Notably, in most pharmaceutical markets, there are both existing drugs, usually off patent, that are a lower level of efficacy at a lower cost, so not as much benefit, but maybe 1/10 the price. And then once your drug's been on the market for 3 years and you have 5 more years until you're off patent, guess what? Some other firm comes along with another drug, and all of a sudden you face competition within the therapeutic market, but not within the particular drug market. So in other words, imperfect competition across different therapeutic alternatives. Then the final piece is that people like pharmaceuticals. Some people don't like taking drugs, for health, but most people turn out it is by far the most preferred form of treatment. And there's a volume of evidence around that really is quite large, that people would much prefer to take a drug than to change their lifestyle or go under the knife or do anything else. They'd much prefer to go to the doctor and say, I can take a drug twice a day, I'm Magic Johnson, no problem, and basically go on with their lives, okay? And so and because many of these drugs, while some of them are focused on things like baldness or whatever that might be very important, many of them are focused on things that are essentially life and death or a very significant issue in terms of your quality of life. And within that, and that's nothing, I don't want to be anti-baldness medication, there you go. So in particular, there's high willingness to pay for clinical breakthroughs for well-defined conditions. So in other words, if you find a drug that does X, if you can solve pancreatic cancer or if you can have a drug that is a very effective treatment against ulcer, right? And as it was at one time, which was a very serious condition at one time, there's going to be a big market for it. However, there's dramatic variation in the overall size of the market. So there's an old phrase that we sometimes use as an economist when describing the pharmaceutical industry: misery loves company, which is that if you're going to get a life-threatening disease, it is much more worthwhile to have gotten a life-threatening disease that a lot of other people have, because then there's a cure. Because if you're the only person who's gotten that disease, or it's a small disease, the economic returns to the pharma industry of working on your disease are very low. Okay? There's so there's significant variation in the overall market size. The high willingness to pay is in fact driven by one big fact that we sort of thought was sort of cute when it occurred back in 1231 or in Romeo and Juliet, but it's that the person who makes the decision about the drug in most circumstances, the physician, is almost completely insulated from the price consequences of paying for the drug. In some cases, at least the patient might complain about it, and then sometimes the insurer will call up and complain about it, though they can't do that too much, it turns out. They can choose not to cover certain things, but people essentially select into plans that have broad pharmaceutical coverage. That's a very common feature in healthcare markets. And so what we see is increasing prevalence over time in insurance coverage for pharmaceuticals, and that has led to this maelstrom, which is a lot of the cases that one would see out there today, that essentially is some complicated negotiation or some complicated set of contracts, some of which are going to be violated and some of which may be legal or not, between pharmaceutical companies on the one hand, prescribing groups on the other hand, i.e. physicians and their healthcare infrastructure, and payers on the third hand, namely insurers. Okay? And so what we end up with is that when all those things are present, when you've got the big fixed cost, low marginal cost, strong property rights, combined with high willingness to pay, you have the makings of a blockbuster drug. Essentially, these are products that essentially so Northwestern University is lucky enough that one of our scientists developed one of these, he came up in the lab with one of these drugs, Lyrica. We licensed it out to Pfizer for 8%, I think, or 6%, whatever it might be, of the total revenues, which might not have been the optimal contract, but given that it was successful, it turned out to be a pretty good contract. And that drug now makes several $1 billion a year, and will do so for about 7 or 8 more years. At which point, we are fairly confident that other drugs will come into the market, and Lyrica's revenues will start to fall, and then the earnings from that will also fall. So what that means is what you see, and this was particularly true in the early 2000s, it's still by and large true, is that when you're buying when you think about the value of pharmaceutical firms, the economic value, they are very often, essentially a very large share of that value is being driven by a very small number of drugs. So for example, Pfizer, during the early 2000s, essentially had probably more than 50% of its profits. The profits of Pfizer were essentially 3 drugs, and then a bunch of smaller things that they made smaller amounts on. So here you have a company worth literally tens of billions of dollars in market value, and of that tens of billions of dollars in market value, it's being determined by the value of a very small number of drugs, each of which can be subject to one of these health scares or therapy scares or whatever it might be. Okay? Now, so what are the pharmaceutical companies then doing? So they have this blockbuster strategy. Then they know that over time, healthcare costs keep on being an increasing share of our economy, going from a relatively small, essentially less than 5% of GDP to essentially more than 20 today. And then moreover, they're investing more to get each major drug to market, but most importantly, pharmaceuticals are an increasing share of total healthcare expenditures. So what's interesting is that back in 1960, when we didn't spend a lot on healthcare and miracle drugs were sort of all there was, and doctors had relatively low salaries relative to today, you actually did have a relatively high share of total expenditures on drugs, but that really fell over the next 20 years, so that by 1980, less than 5% of total healthcare expenditures were concentrated in pharma. That has increased between 1990, 2000, and over the last decade, so that now we spend more than, so let me make sure I get this right, more than 10.3 of the total healthcare budget, and national health expenditures. Oh, no, that's the wrong. Well, I know we spend more than 10.3% of 10.3% of total healthcare expenditures, and total healthcare expenditures are approximately I guess they're 2.25 billion per year in total healthcare expenditures. Okay, what has that done? That's led to a situation where global pharmaceuticals, also we're globalizing, so the US is becoming an increasingly small share of the global market. Now total pharmaceutical expenditures are roughly $600 billion a year. So if you think about that now, well, that's a big number. Even in the world of bailouts, that's a big number. So what you have is essentially $663 billion is the size of the industry, and that's divided between a bunch of different markets. And as you can see, the US is about 304. All of Europe is about 206. And remember, the US and Europe have roughly similar economies, so they spend less revenue relative to the US. And Asia, which is a much bigger market in numbers of people, obviously, spends quite a bit less, but is by far the most rapidly growing. Most importantly, going forward, what we see is an era where this issue of expiration and the movement towards generics is quite salient. So you have all these blockbuster drugs that essentially have either just come off patent or people are trying to manipulate it one way or the other. And essentially, over the next few years, you see most of the major pharma firms essentially facing very significant patent expirations. And so what you get is that there's very, very big present discounted value losses associated with those patent expirations, which leads to what we're going to kind of deal with in some sense in the second session, which is, guess what we have? We have a system that seemed to really have geared up in the 80s and 90s. It delivered a very lot of benefits to society, hopefully, delivered a lot of revenue for the industry. They had this model of blockbuster drugs, and now we seem, given how much we're spending, to not really being produced as much of them, and we'll deal with that more explicitly. In particular, what you see is that after 20, just from a kind of pure financial analysis perspective, Merck, let's just take Merck as kind of roughly the historical market leader. It's fallen off its game, obviously, in the last few years, but the story is similar across a bunch, is that essentially what you have is that the pharmaceutical industry dramatically outperformed the stock market, even during the big bull run of the, essentially from 1987 onwards, for really quite a long time until the mid-2000s. And the last 4 or 5 years, the pharma industry has done worse than the market, and particular companies like Merck have lost a significant share of their market value associated with the loss of particular products like Adviex, and more generally the reputation that they got from those products. So, just to kind of finish up, and let me just see, look at that, I'm 1 minute over. Essentially, where we're going to be going from here is we've kind of now done this overview. What we're going to then be kind of turning to is really getting a little bit closer to really kind of breaking out what's going on the science side, on the innovation side of this industry, and really understanding that question of, is there a productivity crisis in pharmaceuticals and where does it come from? And then finally, in the last session, we'll really think about the commercialization process and how we get drugs from the clinic to the patient. Thanks a lot.